lines and answering your questions tonight. The Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Anthony Albanese. Businesswoman, economist and commentator, Judith Sloan. Aboriginal elder, actor and former cat burglar, Uncle Jack Charles. Assistant Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. And policy analyst, Miriam Lyons, whose latest book, Governomics, argues against small government. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, our Facebook audience has suggested we talk about marriage equality, looming recession and cabinet tensions over jihadi citizenship. We will get to those issues in a short time, but our first question comes from Amanda Marie Voets.
Good evening, panel. I'd like to direct this question to you, Josh. My family is from a mixed heritage, including Scottish and Irish, English and Aboriginal. And as a child growing up with red hair, and many children in the family with red hair, we were often called derogatory names, including Ranger. In fact, one grandson wouldn't have his photo taken at school because he was called a Ranger because of his red curly hair. Do you think that Adam Goode's display of the war dance in front of families and at the football match was divisive, and do you think that he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder in trying to raise the race debate?
OK, we'll start with Josh. This was directed to you. Go ahead.
Look, I didn't have a problem at all with what Adam Goodes did. I had a problem with the result as a Carlton supporter because we got beaten by 10 goals by Sydney. But he's clearly very proud of his Indigenous heritage, and we too as Australians should be proud of him, namely the fact that he has been named Australian of the Year. I thought his explanation for it afterwards was totally legitimate in that he had been mentoring some younger players. This had been something that he'd been teaching them and working with them on to indicate their pride in their culture. And maybe there was some adverse reaction from the crowd that you probably get at a football match, no matter which club you're playing at.
How about Eddie Maguire? He said he shouldn't have run straight towards a group of fans in an aggressive manner.
Well, I know Eddie. I think he's a great part of the sporting legend in Australia, if you like, and a very proud Collingwood supporter and president. But on this occasion, we can differ.
So you're saying that Carlton fans are tougher and they wouldn't be intimidated by an invisible spear?
Absolutely not. And I think just the tension of the game, Tony, would mean that some of the fans would have taken an adverse reaction to that. But by and large, I think we should be proud of Adam Goodes, proud of his actions on that night, and celebrate the fact that he is very proud of his Indigenous heritage.
Uncle Jack, what do you say?
Well, it's a good thing, sister, that you've asked this question. Look, I see in Greg Inglis up here doing his goanna thing. We celebrate, and it's I weep for Carlton. I had a cry for Carlton over its loss and that, and the big man gone and that, But by the same token, this man is celebrating a win, and you're so far up yourself in the moment of the time, you don't know what you're doing. If you're going towards a bunch of the opposition and that, so what? You're celebrating it, and we're educating football, people at football, programs and that to accept that our culture, and what joy it is for me to have watched that. I really liked it, and he got it from these young ones, as he said. He explained it well. We're making a molehill a mountain out of a molehill here.
Yeah, what do you think about the reaction? Waleed Ali from the Project made the point that Australia is a tolerant country, but when someone in a minority reveals they're not a mere supplicant, we lose our minds.
That's true. That's the way the cookie crumbles. He's right. We do jump on something that we're uncomfortable with, and that. I don't think we should be making too much out of this, but just enjoy the occasion. Just learn that there are more black fellas that are, maybe somebody from the big bloke that's been taking some spectacular marks. Maybe he's got some dancers that could, educate us too. Nat Newey, yeah, him.
Judith Sloan, what do you think?
Well, I'm also a Carlton supporter, which, requires a high degree of forbearance at the moment. And in fact,
Is it an ideological thing?
I think some very good people barrack for Carlton, but we've been taking a leaf out of your book, Anthony, by changing leadership mid-course. So we've got rid of Mick.
You should remind him of the last 6 years.
I'll go on. But yeah, look.
That's next week's show.
I mean, I do think it might have been more appropriate if he'd directed his dance to the Carlton players. I mean, I think that, cheer squads are kind of pretty passionate kinds of people. And so I think, there was sort of, when the New Zealand rugby players do the haka, that's directed to the opposing teams. That might, but as you say, it was in the sort of heat of the moment. He'd kicked a goal. He was having a dog of a game, actually, as I understood, up until that point. But, as Sydney went on and won by 10 goals, so Josh and I need to eat crow at the moment, I think.
Anthony Albanese.
People should chill out. He's a proud Indigenous man, a great sportsman and a great Australian. And I think he's a great model for young Indigenous people, and that's what he was symbolising there, just like GI, Greg Inglis. Never forget the goanna after the last try in last year's grand final when South won after 43 years. I just so I get that in.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Amanda, do you want to get back in here? Are you listening to the answers?
Yes, I am. Probably the question that I was really asking was, do you think that Adam's perhaps too sensitive in regards to, a lot of the comments that it was racist when people reacted to it, and it's not necessarily racist.
You mean to respond negatively to that?
Yeah, to respond negatively.
Display.
It was about him, the man, really, more than being racist. And I think he's taking it on board as criticism of his race rather than him, the person. Not just in regards to this particular war dance, but in other things that he said and people's comments.
Let's hear from Miriam Lyons first.
Well, he actually has had to deal with racist abuse from fans of opposing teams in the past. And I think
they've called him a name, but that's my point, that as a redhead and having, come from a family of redheads, as a child, I was always called names, and my grandson was called a ranger. But, as an adult, you become desensitised to it and say, and I'm not saying that I've been through or my family's been through what the Aboriginal Society have been through, not at all. But I'm just saying that sometimes, we can just take it too seriously.
Okay, all right, let's hear from Miriam. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I guess, it's interesting that you're pointing out that, you're a redhead and you've got Irish heritage, because there was a time in Australian history where Irish Australians were extremely discriminated against, and where you would probably expect somebody who was being, was being dissed for being Irish on the field to have been really sensitive to that, because they were subject to extreme discrimination. Now, Aboriginal Australians today are still subject to extreme discrimination, right? And so this is a situation where, exactly like Walid Ali said on the project, I think Australia is a very tolerant society, but we're really intolerant of having our racism pointed out to us. And the reason that Adam Goodes gets booed on the field and say, Jeddah might not, is that, he has been somebody who is known for actually standing up and pointing it out, and calling out that 13-year-old girl when she, called him an ape on the field. And I think it's constructive to bring that out. How are we going to move past it unless we can talk about it?
I've been inclusive of all races since I was a child and only seen that side of things. So.
Thanks, Amanda. We'll just take that last bit as a comment, but I'd just like to quickly go back to Jack to respond to that last part of it. The idea that perhaps Adam Goodes is being too sensitive. What do you say to that?
No, he's not being too sensitive. We do expect it. Australia's not in, it's a unique country. It's peculiarly, from my observation, peculiarly racist against us. You have to know this. If you don't know it, I can't see why you don't know it now. But we see it. It's Australia itself is uniquely racist against Aboriginal Australians. And I can't put it any more succinctly than that. That's my observations. That's the observations of many Aboriginals here in Australia. and that's how it is. And so there's a long journey for us to undertake, and this is just get used to it. That there's no scripting on a football oval. You know, you have no time to say, oh well, I must do my celebration, my celebratory dance towards my team, or not to the other team, and that you can't. Wherever you are,
something happens in the moment.
Spontaneous, yes, spontaneous.
Can I just respond just on this issue of racism, Jack? Because in any society there is prejudice, but there's enormous goodwill in our parliament from both sides of the political divide. I mean, we've got a Prime Minister who has spent many a day in Indigenous communities well before he became Prime Minister, is now spending time out in Indigenous communities. We're trying to reach across the divide in terms of reconciliation and a constitutional change, as well as what, we've gone through that whole process of the apology. And I just think, there was a long way to go. There's a long way to go to improve the indices, but I don't want to colour the whole of Australia as a racist society, because I think there's enormous goodwill towards the Indigenous community.
Mobs of goodwill by a lot of Australians all around the country. But the policies that have making our lives so worse than the poor white people of Australia, to remove us off our remove us off lands, the people at the top end, to remove them from their lands, to develop, to take away funding for the remote territories, and that strikes me peculiar, strange, and I'm trying to look for another word.
The word was actually a phrase, and the phrase was lifestyle choice.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, well, my lifestyle choices now is not being homeless now. Somebody lit a fire under the combined the bums of the Aboriginal Health Service 11 years ago, and they took me off the streets and put me into units. From that time on, I've my life's stable. I've only ever did one berg after I got into that unit, and that's the berg you see in Bastardy, the documentary. Yeah. So just by by keeping on funding housing, the drug and alcohol. I hear they're taking funding out of the drug and alcohol issue. For people.
Jack, we're going to come back into that. Can I just make the point? There's actually a lady there with a hand up. I'll just come to you. Go ahead.
Hi. My name's Imelda Davis, and I'm the president of the Australian South Sea Islanders branch here, Port Jackson, New South Wales state body. I think the Australian Parliament has amnesia when it comes to Aboriginal affairs, and also with Australian South Sea Islanders as the descendants of the blackbird trade. And still today, after being recognised in 1994 by the Commonwealth as a distinct ethnic race, and again in 2000 by the Queensland Government, and still we're struggling in 2013 and 15 for rightful recognition and inclusion of my grandfather, who was brought here as a slave to cut sugar cane. And we're still doing that today. So there's a lot of amnesia happening in the Australian Government in relation to Aboriginal, Torres Strait and Australian South Sea Islander affairs. I'm sorry.
Okay, well that is a...
I'm living it.
We'll take that as a comment, and it was a particularly profound one. But we'll move on because we'll come back to some of these sort of issues later. Our next question is from Michael Davis.
Liberal backbenchers are supporting a hardline approach to the new citizenship laws, whereby the Immigration Minister has the power to revoke citizenship rights of fighters returning from the Middle East, even though they have been charged with no crime. By giving one person the ability to decide another person's guilt, who is not a judge, does the panel think that this type of power is justified?
Miriam Lyons, we'll start with you.
Well, no, I don't think that it is justified, and I was really glad that the proceedings of that cabinet meeting got leaked, and I think it would have been extremely reassuring to a lot of small L Liberals that we did have, the Attorney-General saying, well, it's my job to stand up for the rule of law, and Barnaby Joyce in there saying, isn't that what we have courts for? Which is absolutely right. I think it is far too much power to place in the minister's hands, even if it does have judicial review. We saw the Blair government in 2002, introduced laws that are very similar to this, and initially they were quite tightly constrained. And then after the London bombings, the definition just was blown wide open. And so you had it, like a very broadly phrased idea of what would be allowable to strip somebody's citizenship. And I think it's just a very silly idea for two reasons. Apart from, the kind of basic respect for rule of law and putting too much power in a minister's hands. One, if these people who are fighting for IS are have citizenship of two states, it's quite possible that the second state will not be in as good a position to actually bring them to justice as Australia is. I think the appropriate thing to do is not to wash our hands over them, but if they've committed a crime, if there's enough evidence to try them, bring them back here, see them face justice. The other situation is, what if they want to return home because they have seen just how hypocritical this brutal, savage organisation is? The best possible advocates against IS are not, it's not the people like us. It's not security officials. And this is not just me saying this. This is the former head of MI6 has said, look, the best possible advocates that we can have, the best possible, let's face it, it's kind of a propaganda war that we're fighting here. The best possible people on our side of that
advocates
war.
to use to stop people signing up to IS in the first place.
Exactly.
Let's hear from Josh Frydenberg and take the initial question first. We'll come back to those other issues.
Well, there are two different issues here. There's one which involves dual nationals, which we have said we're going to proceed to introduce legislation this month, which will strip the citizenship of a dual national. And then there is the second piece, which we're consulting more broadly on, and we haven't formalised any plans in this regard, which if someone is only an Australian citizen and they've been involved in terrorist activities, but they were able to access the citizenship of another country, do you strip them of their citizenship? Now, it's really important that everyone understands the context we are in. We've seen 30 Australians at least die in Iraq and Syria, including a number who were suicide bombers. We have another 100 plus Australians who are over there participating in terrorist activities, and more than 150 here in Australia supporting them, either with recruitment or financing. ASIO say that they've got 400 high priority investigations currently underway in Australia. Now, when we strengthened the laws with 4 tranches of national security legislation, metadata, increasing the power of our law enforcement agencies, as well as increased resourcing, we then went around the world and said, what are other countries like Australia doing? New Zealand, France, Canada, and the UK all have laws to strip dual nationals of their citizenship. The UK go one step further, and they can take the citizenship away of just a UK citizen who can access someone else. So we have really gone across the world to see how are other countries responding.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Sure.
Because the principle that was obviously at stake in this cabinet meeting, where there was, as we've just heard, opposition from so many, including the Attorney General and other key ministers, the key problem with the original proposal was the minister would be able to decide the fate of someone's citizenship, but not on evidence that you would see in a court of law, but on intelligence. Do you think that was a wrong idea?
No, I don't. And that is actually the practice in the United Kingdom as well as in other jurisdictions, because you've got.
So you disagree with the Attorney General on this?
No, what I say is that you've got a situation, and I wasn't at that cabinet meeting, so I can't, give you.
Well, we've all
the
read
detail.
what happened in that cabinet meeting.
Some with more glee than others, I suppose. But the point here is that if you've got an Australian citizen who is over participating in a terrorist attack, you will have intelligence agencies who may be able to gather information about that. But that level of information may not withstand the scrutiny in a court of law to get it beyond a reasonable doubt.
So just get this straight.
conviction.
You still think the minister should have the power to strip someone of their citizenship, even though there's not enough evidence to prosecute him in a court of law?
If it's a dual national case, and if it's got the judicial review, which is to see if the power was exercised lawfully, and if you are adhering to our international obligations not to make anyone stateless, I would agree to that.
Right, let's hear what Anthony Albanese says about this.
Well, I think Malcolm Turnbull put it pretty right when he said it was a shambles of a proposal. We don't know precisely what the proposal was, but we know what the detail has been of the Cabinet meeting. We still haven't seen any legislation. It's been 18 months. And I watched Peter Dutton have a train wreck of an interview, frankly, on the 7:30 show tonight, where he could not answer the simple question, which is, what happens if you're a dual citizen and Australia wants to strip you of your citizenship, but the UK, in this example that was used, says no? What happens there? I mean, we need to have proper legislation, needs to be properly thought out, not done on the back of an envelope at the end as an afterthought of a Cabinet meeting with no written proposal, no advice, no co-ord comments from different departments. And I mean, I just find it remarkable. I have complete contempt for anyone who has anything to do with IS and these people who want to wreck our way of life. But it's an irrational act to want to go and be a martyr for so-called jihad. Therefore, I don't think the last thing on their mind is going to be, oh, what's going to happen to my citizenship? Some of these people who are going aren't expecting to be coming back. That's the whole point. And, you know, I'm all for, I'm not a bleeding heart on these issues. I'm all for a hard line, but it needs to be rational, it needs to be thought out, and it needs to achieve its objectives. The objectives at the moment aren't really stated.
Tony, there's a very powerful statistic here. Between 1990 and 2010, 30 Australians went to Afghanistan. So we're talking multiples of that now in Iraq and Syria. Of those 30 who went to Afghanistan, 25 came back to Australia. Of those 25 who came back to Australia, 19 got involved in terrorist activities here in Australia, 8 were convicted, 5 are still in jail. Now, I do not want to look in the eyes of an Australian family who's been a victim of a terrorist attack here in Australia and say, what else could have we done? And that's what we're dealing with here, Tony. This is an incredible threat facing the Australian people. One man in Sydney with one flag and one gun brought the city to a standstill and has put fear in millions of Australians'
we've actually got a question
lives.
on that
This is
precise
serious.
issue. We'll go to that question, bring the other panellists in. It's a question from Thomas Borg. Oh.
My question is directed more to the ministers. The man monarchs of this world were once innocent children. What steps would your government take to make sure that any returned children of jihadists are not going to grow up to be a future threat to the Australian public? And will these children of jihadists, if they are returned to Australia, will they be put back in the same Islamic community that their parents were once part of?
Okay, let's start. I won't actually start with the ministers. We've heard a little bit from them. We'll hear from the other panellists and I'll come back to the politicians. Jack Charles.
Look, he was a mad fella, that fella. Monk or whatever his name is. He was an idiot. And he was a serial pest, and that to the nation and to himself and to Sydney-siders. He had nowhere to go. He was not going anywhere. He's just a stupid fool. And the letter that he'd written to Brandis, you know, should have woken him up that this man has some peculiarities going up in the top paddock here and that, you know, too many kangaroos up there and that should watch him and things like this. So he's an idiot. But getting back to these kids coming back and that, you know, we over here, we counsel, we do a lot of work trying to counsel people off addiction and get them out of a life of crime and etc. and show them a life, you know, out of their, you know, their addictions and their crimes and etc. Look for a future crimeless, you know, and without a criminal record and that, you know. this needs to be addressed seriously. We need to undertake measures for the little fella holding that head and that. There's a lot to unravel in that those children's minds. It should be done out here, and we shouldn't do it. I don't believe, that we...
Doing that unravelling, is it their own community or is it the government? Will they be taken away?
Yeah, Jack, I suppose the suggestion here is that these children should not be brought up within their own community if they are brought back. Now, I suppose we've heard of things like that happening before.
Yeah, so it's been a great lesson to wake up a call to Mum herself and that, I believe that she was powerless. Not very many people, with a husband over there saying, giving him the money to come over here and join me and hold, I want my kid by my side as I'm going on my killing spree and etc. I want to show them how to do it and that. That's not those kids' fault, it's not that mother's fault and that. So they should be able to return here to this country and they should be counselled and their minds unravelled by this serious muck-up that their father, this religion, has wrought upon them.
Yeah, OK. I want to hear from Judith Sloan on this. You've been listening to this conversation. I haven't brought you in yet.
Well, I mean, I guess the de-radicalisation is part of the government's strategy. There's a sort of irony in the idea that a government could achieve that, but, I think that's a project in progress and some thinking needs to be done. I mean, it seems to me that there must be some middle ground in this area. I mean, I think people don't actually realise that in all sorts of matters, the immigration minister has incredible authority. So I'm not sure why people weren't marching in the street about that, to tell you the truth. That's actually how the Immigration Act has been written for many, many years, and they have all sorts of powers, as a matter of fact.
Not until now, the power to strip an Australian of their citizenship.
No. Well, it's not quite that. It's someone who may be able to claim the citizenship of another country. I mean, it seems to me that the way I'd like to see it go...
Someone like Tony Abbott, you mean?
No. The way I'd like to see it go is to suspend citizenship, I think. I think rather than having some sort of final, you're stripped. And then I think, I think the issue with David Hicks was that he was not charged. People need to be charged and it needs to go through a court of law. But at the same time, we shouldn't be naive to be underestimating the threat that this is involved. But, Josh, I don't think you really want another Dr. Hanif, do you? I actually think it's protective of the government of the day to have due process. So suspend for a period of time, that can be stipulated in the law, and then people need to, I think, have their case heard.
Should be dealt with by the courts.
Yes.
Your essential argument.
Yes.
Anthony Albanese, does Labor actually have a position on this? I mean,
we haven't.
Do you have a position? Yes, but you can have a position of principle without knowing what the other side are doing.
No, we can't. No, because
we can't have a position of principle.
We have to wait to see what the government legislation is.
Well, what do you think it should be?
Well, I'm not the government, and I don't have the advice in terms of through the National Security Committee and those issues. The government has a responsibility, a primary responsibility to keep Australia safe. And Labor has shown that we've been prepared to be a party to that. But what we're seeing at the moment is a shambles within the government. With due respect, which position is it you're asking for agreement on? Let's see the legislation, we'll examine it on its merits. With regard to the issue that was raised over here, I think it's very important that we don't speak about the community. There is not the community. The overwhelming majority of people of Muslim faith in my electorate and people I know are loyal to Australia are the people who are the victims themselves. Let's remember, these people primarily want to go over there to kill other Muslims who happen to disagree with them. So it is very important that we work with the Islamic community, bring them with us as part of what is a very harmonious society. A few bad eggs shouldn't tarnish a community.
Yeah, Josh Frydenberg, pick up on the question, because the core part of that was what should happen to these children, and there was a suggestion there they should not be brought up in their own community.
Well, I agree with Anthony here. There are an enormous number of people in Islamic communities who are as abhorred with what is happening with the Islamic State as people of non-Muslim backgrounds. So if we can find those people who could look after these children in a safe environment, then that is a pathway forward.
So, statement of principle here, if those children wanted to come back, and indeed their mother, should they be welcomed back?
Well, I wouldn't have a problem with them coming back into the appropriate care. But as for their mother, she will come back to Australia, no doubt, and face the courts for what may have been her involvement, without prejudicing, without knowing all the facts.
Assuming
her involvement in
you're
activities.
facing the courts if there's evidence?
If there's evidence.
What about if there's only intelligence?
Well, that again will be always be dealt on a case-by-case basis. But for your audience also to understand, ever since 1949, Australia has had the power to revoke the citizenship of a dual national who's been fighting for a country at war against Australia. Right now, the Foreign Minister of Australia, who's cancelled over 100 passports, including a large number of dual nationals, can do so on the evidence of national security agencies. So the Labor Party, I assume, supports those two existing provisions. And I think you're right, Tony, it's only fair to ask them, the Labor Party, to say in principle, subject to being pleased with the legislation when it's brought forward, in principle, they support what is happening in the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Canada and New Zealand, where the citizenship of dual nationals can be revoked when they're involved in terrorism.
I think it was heard that they'll make the decision when they see your legislation.
When they get their act together.
All right, let's move on to a different subject. The next question is a video. It's from Chris Mueller in the Ponds, New South Wales.
Hi everyone, my question's for Anthony Albanese. What do you say of recent criticism of the influence of Joe DeBruyn's union, the SDA, over your party? How can we trust you when you say you support marriage equality, yet you have allowed a super union to bully you into stalling it for a significant amount of time?
Anthony Albanese.
Well, nonsense. We had a vote on it in 2012 in the Parliament. Stephen Jones introduced a bill. I voted for it. I've been a long-term supporter of marriage equality. I brought the first ever private members bill about sexual preference relating to superannuation before the Parliament. Not a Greens political party member, myself in my first term between 1996 and 1998. That was a radical proposition back then. Now it's accepted by everyone. It went through the Parliament unanimously during the last term. And guess what? When marriage equality happens, which it will hopefully this year, people will look back and wonder what the fuss was about.
Let me just ask you this quick question. If you really want to get gay marriage legislation through the Parliament, isn't it better to actually work with the coalition government, since evidently they are moving slowly in that direction, rather than do what Bill Shorten has done and create a kind of wedge issue out of it?
No, absolutely it is, Tony, but the fact is the coalition needed a bit of a nudge. We have been talking about this for 18 months since Labor said, we have a bill, we want to work together. I think people like Josh and Warren Entsch, people of goodwill, will come together. That needs to happen, but it needed a push. And the Irish referendum, that remarkable result, to get that result 2-1 in Ireland, I must say I was surprised by that. I suspect, and I said this in a speech in Parliament last week, I suspect that when the vote comes before both the House and the Senate, there'll be a majority bigger than people expect. A lot of people are being a bit shy up to this point. When it comes on, all it needs is a conscience vote. And what Bill Shorten has done in introducing that legislation before the Parliament is give a focus to the government members to say, come on, let's get on with it.
Okay, let's hear from Miriam Lyons, and I'll go to the government and hear their perspective.
Yeah, look, I understand that there's a potential cross-party bill on the way, which I think would be a really great way for this to get up, a little bit like the RU486 situation. I do think that this is inevitable. Of course, there'll be a little bit of playing around with politics in the meantime, and, the Joe DeBruyn influence is a whole other story. For a long time there, you could have said that, the best way of converting the Labor Party overall on gay marriage would have been to challenge the leadership of that union, of the SDA, which is not even a very good union. But that aside,
it is his right to have that point of view.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've got to be tolerant in this debate.
It is his right. I'm talking about a potential joint grassroots ticket from people who you're working in Woolies and Coles who are not getting either great, workplace representation.
That's true of all union officials.
Anyway, let's leave that aside. Look, I think this is absolutely inevitable. And God damn, about time. Seriously. I mean, I cannot wait until that point when the bit in the Marriage Act that was inserted under John Howard in 2004 is taken out, that part where the celebrant in a wedding, we've all been to weddings, I'm going to a lot of them at the moment, the celebrant has to read out, that marriage is under Australian law an act between a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others. And, a wedding should be a really happy day. And for a lot of weddings that I've been to, there might be a gay groom or a queer bridesmaid or, like really close friends in the audience who are gay. And it's like kind of having the spirit of politics past looking over your shoulder at the ceremony saying, this is not for your queer friends. I'm just really looking forward to us moving past
Josh,
that.
what do you say?
Well, I agree with the comments today. I mean, it is inevitable in Australia, and the fact that 20 other countries in the world have on the statute books gay marriage, and 37 American states means that Australia has taken longer. I'm hoping that we have a conscience vote in our party.
Are the numbers there in your party room for a conscience vote?
Well, I think they are, and I think it's important, though, that we respect the views of both sides of this debate, because people bring their own views, their own experiences, often with a religious background to them. I, like many of the other local members in the parliament, have met with a number of constituents, and my views have evolved after meeting with constituents and seeing the deep affection that people of same-sex relationships have for each other. And, Anthony's been a consistent and strong advocate for same-sex marriage for many years. Others, like me, have come to it later. But I think we just need to respect the views on both sides of the parliament.
Are you convinced Anthony Albanese is right that it will happen this year?
Yeah, I think it will. Yes, I do.
Okay.
And dare I say it, it's Bill Shorten's bill that he introduced today, but it's not Bill Shorten's issue. And that's why it's really important that it is a cross-party agreement.
Yeah. Let's quickly move to another question on this subject. Briefly, it's from Bodie Matthews.
Since the state of New York legalised gay marriage, it has brought $259 million to their economy. So I asked the panel this. If Tony Abbott is all for small business, then why doesn't he agree with the 72% of Australians who agree with legalising gay marriage and also bring this added funds to our kind of failing economy?
Let's ask an economist to start us on. So, Judith.
Well, I'm not sure you'd be doing it for the economic multiplier effect, but I mean, I think that...
But you maybe could.
Absolutely.
Well,
if he's right.
Well, I guess it's true that you would increase the number of formal ceremonies and all the bells and whistles attached to it. So, yeah, I guess that's right. But I mean, I think it's really, it's an important philosophical position, and I think it's right that, we should respect the diversity of views in this debate. I personally am in favour of it. But, I equally respect people who are not. And so, I'm hoping that, there will be a mature getting together of the parliament as opposed to the sort of political parties for this to happen. So, maybe those wedding planners and the like are just sharpening their pencils and thinking
Let me go, Jack Charles, I know it might be a bit late in life to consider marriage. But,
well, never too late.
Exactly. I'm not expecting a proposal here. But what I am about to say is that would you consider, if this legislation is through, getting hooked up, married?
Well, I haven't found Mr. Right yet. I'm not looking really, but it's going to happen. Australia's come of age in this issue. And it will happen down the track, you know, and there'll be a lot of joy. A lot of the heartaches for people who don't agree with it, but I believe that it's going to happen. It's inevitable.
It isn't one of the key things that the people who don't agree with it shouldn't regard moving in this direction as an affront to the current marriage arrangement. No one, it doesn't diminish it, it doesn't alter it. In fact, arguably, it makes it more important because it becomes an inclusive arrangement about people who love each other and are committed to each other. So, you know, I think that's one way. I think there are some people who somehow seeing it as diminishing, you know, current marriages. I don't think that's right at all.
In fact, it could strengthen the sanctity of marriage, because so far the stats show that gay people and lesbian married couples actually get divorced less than straight couples.
I guess it's early days, Miriam.
I think both sides of politics are talking also about exempting religious institutions from forcing them to oversee a marriage of two people of the same sex, because that's what's happened in the United Kingdom. The Church of England is not required to sanctify.
Okay, Assistant Treasurer, you think it should be a stimulatory measure? That's quite a lot of money that flowed into the state of New York after the legislation passed.
Look, it all helps, there I say.
Well, could I say this? It is flowing at the moment in our region. It's flowing to New Zealand. Yeah. A lot of people are going to New Zealand, taking their friends to have ceremonies there. And, you know, it's not about an economic decision, but that is something that will flow from it. But the important thing about the debate that I've seen, someone like Josh has changed his mind, so have others, because people have been respectful in the debate. It's one of the reasons why I support a conscience vote, is because we need to be respectful and bring people with us on this journey. And it's happened, one by one. Colleagues and some who haven't come out, so to speak, in terms of their voting patterns, are ready to do so in coming days and weeks, because they've thought about it, they've spoken to people. Groups like PFLAG have played a really important role. That's the parents and friends of lesbian and gays. They've gone around and spoken about their experience, why even if their son or daughter doesn't want to get married particularly, they don't want to be told they don't have the right to get married. It really is about that basic belonging in society, and I think if we're going to tackle issues like homophobia that are big issues amongst young people, we need to do that by saying you are equally respected. And the debate has been a lot faster than I would have thought, frankly.
And constructive.
Okay, let's move on to other economic issues. Our next question on an economic issue comes from Andrew Wilson.
When Ronald Reagan slashed taxes, unemployment fell from 7.6% to 5.5%. The annual growth rate was 3.1% as compared to 2.4% under Carter. You can look at numerous examples and go back as far as you like. Singapore has shown the world how undeveloped nations can climb out of poverty. It is by having small, honest and efficient government and letting and even making people run their own lives. What socialist paradise does Miriam Lyons want us to copy?
Miriam, I think that's for you.
I'm so glad you asked. So the data internationally shows us that, there is actually no significant relationship within certain bounds between the size of tax as a proportion of GDP and a country's economic performance. You can look at economically performing countries like most of the Nordic countries, which have much, much higher taxes than Australia does. You can also look at low tax countries that are performing really badly. So it's not so much the size of your revenue base, is the way that you use it. So what I'm what I and my co-author Ian Macaulay are arguing in Governomics is not that we should have socialism. You know, we've learned clearly, you know, from the example of the Soviet Union that there's a lot of dangers in the very simplistic, extreme idea that every problem can be solved by putting everything in the hands of the government. Now, that you know, we've obviously seen the problems with that idea. The problem is that now we're under the grip of an equally extreme and dangerous idea, which is that we can solve every problem that we have by putting everything in the hands of private corporations. And when you do that, you lose the power to have the things that governments do best done well.
The problem with the Rudd government is that they didn't control enough, they didn't spend enough. That doesn't seem to be much of a problem in Australia, I've got to tell you.
OK, we'll take that as a comment, but I want to hear from Judith Sloan on this issue.
I'm wondering, Anthony, if you like Ireland so much, maybe we should also have their company tax rate, which is 12.5%. But,
so do you think Reaganomics would work here? I mean, keep cutting taxes and the economy will grow, more prosperity the more you cut taxes.
Well, of course, what happened in the case of Reagan is that they had extraordinarily high marginal tax rates, and they also had lots of loopholes and special arrangements and the like. So what happened at that time was that they cut the tax rates, they lowered the progressivity dramatically, but they also got rid of lots of the loopholes and the like. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's the famous Laffer curve where actually you can reduce the tax rates and increase the tax revenue. So I think, you know, it tells us lots of interesting stories. And I think it's kind of interesting in the current debate about, you know, we actually, I think this was a mistake of the Labor government. We actually have a very, very progressive income tax scale. So the highest marginal tax rate is now 50 cents in the dollar. That's as high as it was since 1988. And it cuts in at actually a relatively low level, just over 2 times average weekly earnings. And then we also have a very, very high tax-free threshold. And I kind of worry about that because we all benefit from public goods. We all take advantage of schools, hospitals, infrastructure and the like. And in other countries, like in New Zealand, they don't have a tax-free threshold at all. So the idea is that all the citizens should be involved from the get-go, right, and participate in financing the role of government. So, you know, it seems to me that there are a lot of issues to unpick in terms of thinking about the role of government in taxation. But, I mean, my position would be this, that we want a tax system which generates no more revenue than is necessary, and we want to do that in as least distortion way as possible. So we don't want to adversely affect investment, savings and work effort. And, you know, I think that is the current debate.
All right, we've actually got another question on tax, and before I bring everyone in, you can reflect on that question and also think about this one. It's a question from Jackie Lane.
After a week or two of the tampon tax tantrums, on Friday we had the WA Premier Colin Barnett and Senator Arthur Sinodinos coming out saying that they thought that reviewing the GST exemption structure and the level should be looked at. When will the government present a vision for reforming the tax system in Australia that includes looking at the GST, negative gearing, capital gains tax and other now institutional incentives that this country can't afford and that merely pander to rent-seeking vocal interest groups, and sadly some of those are women?
Let's start with Josh Frydenberg.
Well, the GST is an efficient tax. It produces $56 billion worth of revenue every year. It's the 3rd largest tax we have, and all the revenue goes to the states. But the Prime Minister is absolutely right, particularly in this political climate. You could only change the GST, whether it was the rate or the widening the base, if you got bipartisan support. You would need all the agreement of the states, and there are, of course, Labor and Liberal states, but you would need the agreement of the Labor opposition. When John Howard and Peter Costello took the GST to the 1998 election, they had the buffer of that huge election win in 1996. They actually lost the 2-party preferred vote because Labor was opposing the GST, and it was a really hard sell. So I think we have to be realistic about it. The first question I thought was really interesting because In terms of company tax, and Judith touched on this, Australia's rate's way too high. We've just cut it for small businesses, but for all those other companies, at 30%, if you go to the United Kingdom, it's 20%. If you go to Singapore, it's 17%. We have 800,000 companies in Australia, but just 12 companies produce 1/3 of our total company tax rate.
But you can only cut it. You can only cut it further by finding somewhere else to get your revenue from. So if you don't have an entire restructure of the GST and other forms of tax revenue, how are you going to ever do anything?
And
like
that's
this?
why we put the discussion paper out there, because when the GST came in, John Howard and Peter Costello got rid of 35 other taxes. So it would have to be a broad consolidation. You know, the politics of this is really hard. You'd need the states to buy in. You'd need real leadership. We need
real leadership in the sense that you'd need the leader, that is the Prime Minister, to make the case to the public. That's not happened.
Well, what we've said is we're going to start this year-long conversation, and I think people are starting to talk about the GST. I mean, take it for online purchases. Currently, the threshold's $1,000 for GST application to online purchases from overseas. I think there's now a consensus around bringing that down to something much more realistic, like in the United Kingdom, which is £15, or in Canada, which is £20.
Okay, very briefly, before we hear from the other panellists, is it any idea yet what it would cost to take the GST off tampons?
Well, I think, you know, the Treasurer will have more to say about that in coming days.
Let me just ask you the obvious question. Would it be in the region of $100 million across the forward estimates?
No.
Well, I'll leave that to the Treasurer, other than say that's the numbers that have been speculated on. And again, the Treasurer, after appearing on this show, said he'd take it to the states. He's asked the Treasury
So that's the number that's been speculated on? Do you know of any other numbers?
I may do, but I'm not going to reveal it tonight.
Are they in that ballpark?
That's a good try, Tony.
Anthony Albanese.
From Joseph at last week.
Anthony Albanese. The whole question, I mean, the Labor Party is buying into the tax cutting thing because you actually upped the ante in a sort of Dutch auction on budget night, or a couple of days after the budget, by suggesting a 5% small business tax cut. So I guess you must agree that cutting tax is good.
Well, tax is now higher at 22.3% than it was under the former Labor government. Spending is as high as it was at the peak of the global financial crisis when we had the economic stimulus plan. That was a good thing. I think that, of course, taxes should be lower if possible, but we need to make sure that the tax system is progressive, that it's efficient, and that those who can afford to pay do indeed pay, and that those that should be paying, such as the measure that we have to deal with multinational tax avoidance, $2 billion over the forwards, $7 billion over 10 years. That's a practical suggestion that we've put forward to increase the tax base, to maintain its progressivity. I mean, Judith raised the issue of the tax-free threshold. I'm very proud that we took 1 million Australians who are at the poorest level out of the tax system. I'm very proud of that. That increased their living standards to those who most needed it, and a more equal society is actually good economics as well.
Let me just ask you,
because they spend their money on purchasing and creating jobs.
Quick answer to this if you can. Do you seriously think you can reinstate the Gonski funding for education, pay the full cost of NDIS and give a 5% tax cut to 2 million small businesses and not raise big taxes somewhere else?
Well, I've already said that we have $20 billion of revenue measures on the table between the multinational tax measures and superannuation changes. Now, there's been some criticism of us for that, but I think we as an opposition halfway through the term deserve credit for putting those practical suggestions out there, and the government can take it up anytime they like.
A hand just shot up in the front there. I'll quickly go to you. Go ahead.
I'm an accountant and I see a lot of tax leak, and I think that it's a good idea that the government starts putting more money in resources to catch those tax leaks, because it affects the Centrelink. So what they're doing is they have this huge tax leaks and then they get Centrelink on top. But I just would also like to make a comment about company taxes. In Australia, we have fully...
You can make a very brief comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have fully franked dividends here. So those taxes that the company pays gets downstreamed So there's a false attitude or false comparison when you talk about Australian company taxes to the rest of the world.
Okay, we'll take that as an expert comment.
I'm so glad that you said that because it was exactly what I wanted to bring up.
They are still
Australian
high though,
company
even
tax.
if you make that. They are. Look, I agree, but I mean, no one's talking about getting rid of dividend imputation.
No, we know that, but if you cut company
I understand
taxes,
that.
then there's not as much credit.
Okay,
There was
a brief one, Josh.
There was a big focus in the budget on multinational tax avoidance, and we're strengthening the Tax Act, what is called Part 4A, the anti-avoidance provision.
Okay, let's move on. We've got another question, completely different subject, from Jackie Maxton.
Thank you, Tony. Given the shameful overrepresentation of Aboriginals in prison, particularly Aboriginal young people who make up almost 50% of the juvenile justice population, wouldn't it be better if governments of Australia diverted resources from the criminal justice system and incarceration into crime prevention strategies such as early intervention, treatment programs, diversionary programs, in the most needy communities? Wouldn't that be a better investment of taxpayers' funds?
Yes. I've been trying since I've come out to be. It's been 11
You mean
years
come
now.
out or come out of prison?
Come out of the neck.
Come out of the neck.
And I have been trying desperately to. I came out intentionally to be my community's Federfoot, Kadacha man, lawman. It seems I have become that because I've gone up against my would-be-could-be gangster cousin dealers and I've waggled a finger, stamped a foot and pointed the bone at their behaviour. So I'm in this unique role of trying to set up, in my own right, a revisitation of a workshop that we had in the 70s. I'd like to run it now. Circus Oz has just given me spaces at the old Collingwood Tech, right behind our neighbourhood justice centre. I've already spoken, Judge Fanning down there, one of the judges, magistrates there, are aware that I wouldn't mind having many of his charges that the people to do their CBOs in the Nintabaya workshop. I'll be starting off with pottery first because that's where I'm pretty good at hotshot potter. And so I'll be setting up a pottery shop. We'd have the cottage industry there too. But also there's a theatre there, there's a gym there. And so I intend this to be the hub. The Nintabaya workshop. It's not only for Aboriginals, but it's all for those that are struggling, the Somalians that are into the shit now. You know, they can come and access the Nintabaya workshop and find something to do with in the course of their lives. We can start tweaking, turning their lives around, but it's very difficult.
Jack, we just heard those figures and they're pretty shocking. The number of Aboriginal kids in prison, in juvenile prisons, staggering. 50% of the prison population.
I know Royal Park Boys Home have just invited me.
How do you turn that around?
Well, you need people like myself with the lived experiences, men and women beyond reproach. There are quite a few people going into prisons now, young ones, and they're spreading the word of being role models, big brothers and big sisters to the young ones in institutions and that.
So ironically, they won't let you in the prisons though, will they? Because you've already been there.
I believe we're on the cusp of, it's taken a long time, but I've kept on pushing myself to be taken seriously. And now, just recently, I was invited into Malmesbury Youth Training Centre. And once unleashed in such a venue like that, I really feel the power. Because I'm there to relight the burning embers of many a black fella, white fella, Somalians dreaming. That's my role in life. And so the workshop, the Nintabaya workshop's going to happen. It's on the cards, and I'm going to be the public spokesperson for it. And
sounds like you already are.
Well, yeah. and this has been coming, and this is the way we can save lives, by allowing those of us with the lived experiences that have the passion. There's not very many of us that have the passion to go back into prisons and that to share the journey, to come in regularly. I must say that the business of being a U-Butte performing artist has been a great distraction from that. I could have been saving lives rather than going over to England and doing Pan or something like that.
But Jack, don't you think the broader issue is that we need to create an environment where all young Indigenous and non-Indigenous children can have lives of purpose with high rates of employment. You know, ultimately that is the solution. So yes, we need activities and contributions like yourself, but the broader issue is that we need to give them reason to go to school, you know, excel at school and take their place in the workforce, because that's really how a lot of us kept out of trouble, because we were kind of too busy, I guess. So
and youth unemployment's a real problem in Australia. See, unemployment for Australians across is about just over 6%, but youth unemployment's closer to 14%. You can go to some parts of our country where it's 21, 22%. So there was an initiative in the budget where over $200 million was ploughed into groups like the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and others to partner with them to get them to work with young people to prepare them to get in front of an employer with the type of skills and preparing simple things like preparing a CV and other sort of skills like that, so that they can actually try to get a job.
Well, there was another initiative in the
Anthony Albanese,
Yeah,
first, quickly.
You raised before the issue of Gonski. Gonski had the support of both political parties at the last election, said they'd support it. One of the things about it is that the funding goes according to need. So in particular, targeting areas of need to make sure that those pockets of disadvantage get addressed.
Quickly, Miriam.
I'm just saying there was another initiative in the budget which was forcing those young people who are out of work to live on fresh air and sunshine for a month before they're able to access Centrelink benefits. Now, at least it's come down from 6 months. But, you know, this really, I think it represents some idea that we sort of have that's very widespread in Australian society, that if you're rich, the way of getting you to work harder is to treat you better. And if you're poor, the way of getting you to work harder is to treat you worse. You know, like this is really what we're doing in a situation where unemployment is increasing, where, you know, we've got 5 job seekers for every job that's available. Why on earth would we punish young people, making them wait for a month before they can get Centrelink?
I'm sorry to interrupt your flow there. We've got time for one brief last question. It's from Richard Ma.
This is for Uncle Jack. It sounds like you've had an amazing life. I'm just wondering, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self today?
If I was 20 years old, I would tell myself to go hunt up your identity, find out who you are, and keep at, do better at glass bevelling. I was a hotshot glass beveller in those days, doing glass bevelling. And 20 years old, I was a glass beveller by day, and I was learning another trade at night. No, not that trade, acting. I was treading the boards at the new theatre down in Melbourne, and that's and I did 7 years there. So that's what I would tell myself to do, just to strike forward. And I would, if I knew I'd had the hindsight of the knowledge that I've got, I would don't go shooting white powder up your arms. You'll turn out into a white man. You'll turn into a white gangster.
Okay. I did want to go around the whole panel on that question, but I'm afraid that is we're over time. That's all time we have for the program. Please thank our panel: Anthony Albanese, Judith Sloan, Jack Charles, Josh Frydenberg, and Miriam Lyons. Thank you very much. Now, next week on Q&A, radical African-American philosopher and theologian Cornel West, the Prime Minister's sister, Christine Foster. Her brother opposes gay marriage but says he'll still go to her wedding. And the special envoy for citizenship, Philip Ruddock. We'll tell you the rest of the panel during the week. Until next week's Q&A, good night.